so much for being here. So, turning to the subject of tonight's program, it may appear that the Rohingya crisis is very far from northern Michigan, but in fact, the number of connections between IF members and this issue are pretty amazing. So, let's consider for a moment the two top UN officials in the eye of this storm. This is Mark Cutts. He is head of the UN Office for Humanitarian Assistance in Myanmar. He's been there for several years. Now, it worked. Tim Doherty is a member of our IF board. He's a VP out at Interlaken, and they are related. That is the brother-in-law of, Mark Cutts is the brother-in-law of Tim Doherty. And Tim's son, Trevor, spent a lot of time with his uncle in Myanmar and shared one of his films about the crisis with an NMC class on Tuesday. All right. One of the other important UN people involved, Yang Lee, is the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Myanmar. You may have seen her on the news. She was college roommate of Patty Pellizzari, and they remain in close contact. And in fact, originally, either Mark Cutts or Yang Lee, who is Korean, she lives in South Korea, were going to Skype in for part of tonight's discussion. And the fact that neither of them were able to, I think, says a lot about just how critical this issue has become right now. So, what other sort of connections do we have? Pam Lassers, Pam and Harold. Pam is right here. She organizes and has for some years organizes tours to Myanmar on behalf of Abercrombie and Kent. And she has led tours there herself, and she knows quite a bit about the country. Ghulam Rabbani. We'll probably hear from Ghulam later, but Ghulam is a former human rights lawyer in Bangladesh, very knowledgeable about ethnic minorities and identity issues in the region, and he now lives here in Traverse City with his family, and he also presented to NMC students on Tuesday. Now, not pictured are Luann and Jim McKimmey. I know they're in the audience here somewhere, and their daughter and family have adopted 2 Rohingya boys. And so they are living down in the Grand Rapids area, and I bet that Luann and Jim know more about refugee camps in Thailand than, many people in the country. And so finally, that leads us to Sara Curran, whose parents, Ted, Marcia, are longtime IF supporters, and that is one of the main reasons that we were able to bring Sara here tonight. So can I ask, before we go any further, how many other people in the audience have a special connection to this issue or have traveled to that area? I see a few more hands, and I just happened to talk with somebody who has met with the Dalai Lama just on the way in. And so I just want to have you all appreciate what an impressive community this is. And it really helps to explain why IF has been so successful for 24 years, because of the depth of experiences that you all bring to these issues. So, all right, so let's get started. We're done with that. So Sara Curran is the daughter of diplomats Ted and Marcia Curran. Born overseas, she saw more action in the Middle East before the age of 4 than most Americans experience in a lifetime. I wish we could do a whole program on Ted and Marcia's experiences working for the State Department, whether they were opening up Yemen, briefing President Reagan, greeting the return of U.S. hostages held in Iran, or leading the nerve center at the State Department called the Ops Center. They led exciting lives and made a real contribution to U.S. foreign policy over the years. It's no wonder that Sara developed a lifelong interest in other countries and societies. She is an eclectic thinker whose great strength is the melding of different subjects, starting first at University of Michigan, where she got a Bachelor of Science degree in natural natural resource management. Now, I might add that her colleague at the time, her friend and classmate, was Glenn Chown, who also got a similar degree at the same time. Sara then went on to get her master's and PhD in sociology and economics. She has lived and worked around the world, specializing in Southeast Asia, where she had a knack for being on the ground at times of difficult transitions. For instance, she served in the Peace Corps in the Philippines in the waning days of the Marcos regime, and she had to flee from the small village she lived in because of suspicious revolutionary activity directed against her. She conducted social demographic research in Thailand for over 25 years, observing close up several government turnovers there. And particularly relevant to tonight's discussion, she directed a USAID project in Myanmar from 2012 to 2016 aimed at strengthening the capacity of civil society to become more critical and discriminating consumers of information. This was just as the country was going digital after having been under the rule of an authoritarian military junta for 40+ years. And one of the things Sara can talk about tonight is how the introduction of Facebook in Myanmar actually made the Rohingya crisis worse. Today, Sara is the director of the Center for Demography and Ecology and professor of international studies, sociology, public policy, and governance at the University of Washington. She represents the cutting edge of the type of interdisciplinary work being done, melding scientific methods and inquiry with social issues. I am thrilled to welcome her on stage.
Such a nice introduction. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So thank you very much for having me tonight. It's really a pleasure. I was telling TJ, our audio guy, that it's actually more pressure to speak to a friendly, knowing audience who knows you well from when you used to play tennis in Benzie County in Crystal Downs, Crystal Lake, than it is to speak to a large number of undergraduate students. So I'm a little nervous. I'll get used to it. I'll settle down. Thank you to the International Affairs Forum. Thank you to the wonderful Northwest Michigan communities from which I've learned so much. Thank you to my parents and for being so wonderful and supportive of me, and particularly my mother, who was an excellent consult to, this week as I prepared my talk. And last but not least, go blue. So, before we get going, I thought that it would be particularly apt to acknowledge Stephen Hawking's passing and his very progressive and important voice around progressive ideals. And I just thought I would let you take a moment to read his words spoken in September 23rd, 2015. Yes. And I think the message of tonight's talk, while it's going to be pretty hard to listen and to take on the challenges of what the Rohingya are facing, we do need to come together and live together with tolerance and respect, and I hope we can do that. So the Rohingya refugees, as Karen mentioned, many of you are well aware of the situation. It's been in the New York Times just today, in the print edition of the New York Times, is a crisis that's long in the making. And I'm going to talk through a few of the three different elements for why it's been a crisis long in the making. And then I hope to conclude with a few suggestions. So I'll set the stage for the talk by telling you who they are, what is their plight, how their plight brings into high relief pending humanitarian crises and the challenge of statelessness. And then we'll turn to my 3 points, crisis long in the making. We'll finish up with thinking about how we need to better recognize institutional capacities in societies that are in the midst of transition and do a better job of building them up and supporting them. And then a few ideas for what you can do for the Rohingya and for stateless people. So who are the Rohingya? They are predominantly a Muslim people. They speak a language that is close to Bengali Assamese, which is related to Chittagong dialect, which is very close to them in nearby Bangladesh. They write with an Arabic script, which is a relatively recent addition. It was modified, now it's modified to fit the particular tonal nature of the Rohingya language, and it's called the Hindi script. They also speak Urdu and English and Burmese. They have lived in their land in the Arakan Kingdom since about the establishment of that kingdom since the 12th century, which then became the Rakhine State in formerly Burma and now Myanmar. They have been stateless since 1962, and they were excluded from a Myanmar citizenship list of 135 ethnic and religious groups since 1982. So just to give you a sense of where they live, if I can get this to work. Well, Myanmar, as many of you know already, in the middle of mainland Southeast Asia. The Rohingya are located right about where that circle is. There are currently 700,000 displaced from their land since August 2016, and 75% of that 700,000 were displaced since August 2017. This is a tremendous, dramatic fleeing from their country. They are the largest population of stateless in the world, approximately 1.5 to 2 million of them around the globe, in a population of stateless people that's estimated at 10 million. There are currently 1 million refugees in Bangladesh, and they face a humanitarian crisis with the approach of the monsoon season and the rainy season. So let me tell you a little bit about Bangladesh and Myanmar. So Myanmar is about the size of Texas, a little bit smaller than Texas, population of 50 million. As I said earlier, it has a recognized 135 ethnic groups. Its economy in 2016, $1,275 sort of GDP per capita. Its primary economy is driven by oil, gems, tourism, and illicit drugs. It's been in a state of civil war since 1948. There has been a partial peace accord since 2012 and been negotiated between 2012 and 2016. And it is currently characterized as a hybrid regime, primarily controlled by the military, but with some elections. The people who are fleeing from Myanmar are moving to Bangladesh. These million refugees are joining a country that is, 1/4 the size of Myanmar, with a population that is 3 times larger. It's the highest population density in the world. It's a predominantly Bengali Muslim country. Its economy is slightly better than the Myanmar economy, and it is a democratic government, although it is under some stress currently. Well, where are we in this place? Rakhine State is colored in red. Cox's Bazar is where these 1 million refugees are located. And it's right across it's in Bangladesh, right across the border. Here is a satellite imagery of the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, and some numbers since August 2017. This is a remarkably dense concentration of refugees in the world. That said, the Rohingya are actually, because of, and I'll cover this slightly, but we can talk about it a bit more in the Q&A, but the Rohingya have been displaced multiple times since the 1947, since the independence of Burma from the British, and they are now located around the world. Besides the population in Bangladesh, which is now about 1 million, there are Rohingya also located throughout the rest of Myanmar, 150,000 in Malaysia, 350,000 in Pakistan, and 200,000 in Saudi Arabia. So this is a huge population, a diaspora of people who have absolutely no state identification. What I'd like to do now is talk about some of the crisis long in the making, and then we can turn to potentially some interventions. But first of all, let's talk about these three, what I would thematics: empires and conquests, nation building and Buddhism, power and weaknesses of personalities. And these have led to this, the two convergence of both statelessness and this domestic narrative that they are not us. So let's begin first with Arakan State, which was founded or seen to be founded in the 9th century, maybe confirmed around the 12th century, and then was conquered by the Burmese in 1785. At that point, there was the first documented wave of refugees from Arakan State to what is now Bangladesh, but at the time was India, the colony of India, the British colony. And a person named Hiram Cox was sent to negotiate the settlement of these refugees, hence the name Cox's Bazar. The British then felt threatened by the Burmese kingdom on their Indian border and subsequently conquered Burma in 1824 and held Burma until about 1937. And during this period of time, they were part of the Indian, for the most part, they were part of the Indian colony, although they often petitioned to have their own British Crown colony. At this time, India encouraged the flow of people from, Britain encouraged the flow of people from India into Burma, and there were Indian merchants, there were Indians who were emissaries of the state of the British Empire who were serving and ruling in Burma. The Rohingya population grows during this period, and the British start to do what they had done around the world. They start to make lists and censuses and count people, and they count the Rohingya at that time. They're listed as Arakanese in the 1911 and 1927 censuses taken by the British. The Japanese invade. There's a Japanese incursion during this from 1937 to 1945, and the Rohingya land on the side of the British fighting the Japanese. This map is a 1886 map of the British Empire, and first of all, noting the conquering of Burma, and the highlighting of two women sort of seated in the middle of the map next to Britannica, and then I circled the location of India. Fast forward, 1947 independence, granted to Burma by the English, And at this time, there were anti-separatist movements. In other words, movements of people who lived in Burma who did not want to separate from the British colony. They wanted to remain in the Commonwealth. And those people were primarily Muslims, Hindus, and Chinese. And they were very adamant about not splitting and becoming independent. During this period between 1947 and 1962, there's a lot of political instability. The newly independent Burma is really having a hard time maintaining control over its peoples. There are a number of ethnic disputes and land claims and the civil wars between different ethnic groups in the country begin. By the time, basically there have been 16 different civil wars in Burma during this time. 1960, for the whole period of this civil war period. 1962, the military decides it's going to take over and make things better. And they take over the government, take down the democratically elected government, and they begin to impose order on this new state. At this time, the Rohingya are listed as foreigners. They're not listed as citizens, but they're listed as foreigners living in Burma. Again, the civil wars continue during this period. In 1982, there's a new citizenship law and a new effort by the Burmese military to try to articulate a unified Burma. And as part of that articulation, they list 135 ethnic and religious groups, and this is their way of identifying a nation. And but of all of the groups that they could list, the only group that was excluded were the Rohingya. During this period, there's a growing number of, there's a military crackdown for the military junta is running Burma, and little investment. There's a fairly healthy education system up until 1988. And then there's a very large student movement that rises up to challenge the military authorities. It's supported in part by a Buddhist network of schools. And at this time, Myanmar leaders try very hard to seek some recognition and domestic resolution, and particularly around the various civil wars, especially those that involve ethnic groups that are either Buddhist, Christian, or animist, but not the Rohingya Muslims. But the 1988 point is often a touchstone for many people in Burma, and it's called the 8888 movement, August 8th, 1988. And you will see reference to it in numerous historical national rhetoric. Over this period, 1991, throughout this period, and I'll touch on it in a moment, but over this 1988 to 2007, the government continues to be challenged by maintaining peace and civility in the country. And at various moments in time, the Myanmar military has pushed the Rohingya out of the country. So in 1991-92, there's another military cleansing, and 125,000 Rohingya are pushed off back into Myanmar, Bangladesh. As you know, at the same time, Aung San Suu Kyi is becoming an international human rights icon, and as part of her 1991 recognition of receiving a Nobel Peace Prize, the Myanmar government is seeking to get some international recognition. The neighboring countries, including Bangladesh, would like the Rohingya to move back and be accommodated back into Myanmar. So there's some accession of them, allowing them to move back. So those Rohingya move back to Myanmar for some period of time. Another moment in Myanmar's history, 2007, 2008, and let me back up for a second. I know I'm making things maybe more complicated, but we can clarify later. But during this, from after the 1988 student revolution, the Myanmar junta completely cracked down on education institutions. And there was absolutely no investment in higher education, little investment in secondary education. And most of the schooling that took place in Myanmar took place in small Buddhist temples. They took place in Christian schools all throughout the country. And for the most part, the military ignored that schooling. That led to a very strong network across religious, among religious people and among religious institutions that really solidified and became recognized with the 2007 Saffron Revolution, where monks came out en masse to peacefully march on behalf of opening the country up for democratization. But that network of sentiment still resonates throughout the country. And this was sort of enhanced in 2008 with Cyclone Nargis, which some of you may remember. That moment was a huge natural disaster, humanitarian crisis in 2008. And it created a space for international NGOs to come into Myanmar and help. And it led to sort of a nascent civil society organizations, a building of civil society in Myanmar. And that, helped to sort of encourage the possibility for the military to open things up further. 2011, just after the 2010 opening up and the serious movement, there's an emergence of a Buddhist nationalist movement from within Myanmar seeking political recognition and seeking to claim Myanmar as a Buddhist nation and a Buddhist government. So that's a second dimension. We have the building of a nation, how that has been characterized in Myanmar over the last 50 years. And we also have this issue of personalities and sometimes our over-reliance on the possibility of particular persons. I wanted to point out, many of us are really puzzled about why Aung San Suu Kyi, how could this have happened? And it is complicated, but let me first tell you that the roots of who she is, lie with her father, who is the father of the nation, seen as the father of the nation. He was initially a communist, but he fought on the side of the Japanese against the British. He had a very strong legacy of anti-British, a very strong anti-British legacy. She was one of the leaders of the 1988 student movement. She was under house arrest from 1989 to 2010. She is the head of the National League for Democracy, which is the major party in the major political party in the country. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991, and through that was able to leverage significant external and international pressure on the Myanmar state, which included economic sanctions from around the world. It included military sanctions. It included a fair range of pressure on the Myanmar government from about 1992 until 2012, when 2014, when those sanctions were started to be lifted. She was elected as a member of parliament in 2012. She became a power-sharing leader in 2016. The Myanmar Constitution was written by the military junta. It is specifically will not allow anyone who is married to a foreigner and or has a son who is a foreigner, child is a foreigner, meaning that person can never be the president or the prime minister of the country. Specifically, the military junta did not want her to become the head of the country. Nevertheless, in the 2015-2016 elections, she was awarded, she was her party's leader, she won the election, she put forward a strong ally of hers to be the prime minister, and she held sort of a quasi temporary state head leadership role. She has not done she has made no public acknowledgement of the crisis for the Rohingya. She will not, she has in fact denied it. She has called it fake news. And she has been unable to step forward. Consequently, her honorary status have been revoked by the US Holocaust Museum, Freedom of Dublin City Award, Unison's honorary membership, and on and on. There's currently a petition to revoke her Nobel Peace Prize. A few more points I want to make. One of the things that I think as Americans we often take for granted is just how hard it is to build democratic institutions. And I want to make sure that we have a word of caution around how quickly countries can emerge from authoritarian rule and become democratic. Myanmar has extraordinarily weak institutions. Its education institutions, its laws, its judicial system. It has had almost no free and fair media. Instead, there's a very strong informal trust network that's built on friendships and relies heavily on friendships and family for over 50 years. The military is still one of the most powerful in the world. I cannot emphasize this enough. While we don't think of it as a mighty place, relative to the number of people in Myanmar, 50 million people, it is 12th for the number of personnel. I think it's 400,000 people are conscripted into the military in Myanmar. It's ranked first per capita for attack helicopters, the first for armed tanks, and the first for combat aircraft. The military controls 25% of the seats in parliament by constitution. In addition, it has its own political party. So in essence, the military controls a major part of the government. As Karen mentioned, one of my projects between 2012 and 2016 was directing a USAID initiative to build capacity in the looming face of people coming online and being a part of the digital revolution. There was a lot of excitement about that and that possibility at the time, but also a lot of concern. And in fact, in 2012, one of the main reasons we got the grant we did was because we were arguing for the importance of people being able to understand how to discriminate between good information and bad information. Really basic ideas that we teach and take for granted here in the United States. I know. So in 2012, mobile phone uptake was at 2%, mobile phone penetration, internet penetration, mobile phone and internet penetration at the time in Myanmar is basically the same thing because everybody was getting a smartphone. By 2017, it's up to 80%. It's one of the most remarkable success stories. This Forbes article is about just how remarkable that uptake was. Very weak critical and discriminating skills. And most people in Myanmar equate Facebook with the internet. What does that mean? That means, okay, why was it so compelling? Facebook is about friendship networks. It's about trusted friendship networks, Facebooking with friends. They thought which built exactly upon their whole social infrastructure, which was based on friendship and family networks. They did not realize, first of all, that Facebook has all sorts of algorithms, is paying attention to you, and watching you, and they also didn't realize the nature of how those walled-off spaces that Mozilla's research team found, 90% of users in Myanmar are engaging in walled gardens, relatively constrained, not with free access to all information, not able to see all information that's available. Now, what I want to say here is that there is a pluralistic, progressive narrative in Myanmar. There are people who are very well educated, who understand the constraints, but it's very hard to amplify that voice in this context. So I want to just say the Rohingya crisis reveals the limits of international systems. The Rohingya face a really critical humanitarian crisis in the next 6 months. I mean, it's going to get bad when the monsoon rains arrive. They are the largest stateless population in the world. Stateless claims have no international mechanism currently for legitimating people who are stateless. Myanmar makes significant sovereignty claims, which are respected in the international system by the United Nations, which makes it very hard for anybody to come in and assess the possibility of genocide, and makes it very hard for the possibility of placing peacekeepers, perhaps, in Rakhine State to help repatriate the Rohingya. What can you do? You can speak about this. You can support and speak up about the Rohingya. These are a number of the major organizations that are working on the ground in Rohingya, in Cox's Bazar. You can also get involved if you're a high school student. It may seem like a quirky issue, but you can get involved with the stateless convention to eliminate statelessness by 2024. That action plan has 10 points, which I'll let you take a minute to read, and I won't yell it at you. And you can sign the open letter to end statelessness. And you can find that on the UNHCR website. Thank you. How bad? How was the time?
That was an amazing presentation.
Karen saw the presentation on Tuesday, which was way worse.
Oh, it was really good too, but wow. I mean, just by reorganizing and highlighting it, there is just so much food for thought. So this is your opportunity now to explore certain issues. Kim over here with a microphone, Lois over here with a microphone. I see one hand right here. If you try to keep comments a bit short, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Go ahead.
Nope. I'll use my big voice.
Sure.
Has the Dalai Lama spoken up at all about this situation?
Karen asked me that question. I don't know the answer. Does anybody else?
Has the Dalai Lama spoke up about this crisis? Does anyone know?
As you know, the Pope was there last fall, and it ended up being a rather awkward dance in Myanmar.
Somebody could look up on their smartphone.
Yeah,
real
somebody
quick,
else should do that.
Maybe a corollary question is, what has been the role of the other major regional players, China, India,
Right.
Thailand? Are they at all interested in helping the Rohingya, or are they basically supporting the government in Myanmar?
Yeah, the regional actors for a number of years, and I know my Peter Elliott, who's here, will know this because he was based in Southeast Asia. During this period between Myanmar, during the 1990s and 2000s, Myanmar very much wanted to become part of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And in addition, China wanted to be a part of the ASEAN collective. And so Thailand in particular sponsored Myanmar's accession into ASEAN and has had a mixed relationship with Myanmar. They host a number of refugee camps on the eastern border of Myanmar in Thailand. They do host a few Rohingya as my map showed. But Thailand and China have significant economic interests in Myanmar. If you go to Myanmar, you will see Thai development construction companies doing a lot of the building in Myanmar. They have a great deal of interest in the oil and accessing the gas and oil lines, and they have an interest in the gem market. So it's a bit fraught, and they're not interested in upsetting the Myanmar government because they have licensing deals and arrangements with the Myanmar government.
Could I maybe ask, where is Luann and Jim McKimmey right now? Would you mind just describing? Can we have a microphone right here? Raise your hand again, please. Would you mind describing? I believe the Rohingya boys were found at a camp in Thailand. Could you just comment on how that worked and how that might help us understand the situation better?
Knowing what went on is very difficult. There's no language, there's no records that came with them. Yeah. Even trying to get them into our schools is difficult because there's no way to inform the schools about what happened. Briefly, at about military age, the family put together whatever resources they were able, bought a ticket out. We do not know what that means. But a boat floated in the ocean, tried to get into ports, undocumented. They were not allowed in any ports. When food was finally sent out, the food caused the capsizing of the boat that they were on, and the boy swam for 4 hours before fishermen could pick him up and out of the water. And then he was taken to Thailand and wound up in the Bethany Christian Services. Now that's the first boy. The second one came about 6 months later, a similar story, but great difficulty in language and understanding what they have been through. They are in contact with their families versus via the Skype methods. So once a week, they have an appointment to contact with families. The families have been split up, one crossing the river. It was good to see your pictures of that river. The other family not making it. So they don't know really what has transpired with all of those, the rest of their family. Population is a real issue because there is no birth control, and they talk about coming from large families, what we can communicate with them. They're learning. Luann may want to comment.
Thank you, Jim.
No, I don't have any more comments. If there's questions that people have to ask. We find these kids to be extremely hard workers. Jim helped one of them learn how to lay a floor, and he picked it up within minutes and laid the whole floor throughout the cottage that he was doing. Smart kid. And the other one was a little more rebellious when he first came, but he has settled down nicely, and they're going to school and they're being successful, and they fit into the family very well. So
Thank you. And in fact, I mean, that raises an issue that I think you've talked about, Sarah, in terms of the education of the Rohingya. And so as they're,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Why don't I mean, Poppy McPherson mentioned it, but because the Rohingya were denied citizenship, they have been denied education for decades. They have been denied access to health care for decades, other than that which is provided by humanitarian organizations. And they have been denied freedom of movement. So consequently, it's pretty hard for them to communicate and have any ability to understand and communicate with the rest of the world.
okay.
Point that was in the list that you just showed a couple of slides ago regarding
Right here.
Hi. Regarding gender discrimination.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
there anything specific to that region on that point?
Where, I don't know where you are.
I'm right here.
Way in the back. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, you shield your eyes.
Well, we don't, you know, it's a Muslim community, and you might make some assumptions about gender there. But personally, about the Rohingya in specific, I don't know, other than, you know, one might make some guesses, especially with regards to family composition and having multiple wives, et cetera, through the Muslim Islamic system. But in Myanmar itself, gender is an issue, and then I would say that the Myanmar military has used gender in a destructive way in terms of targeting and raping women in Myanmar villages, and even the Rakhine people have also been accused of doing that. Did you want me to show a slide? I couldn't remember if someone was asking for, no.
Okay, Carl?
The basis for the long-standing antipathy toward the Rohingya.
Why are they hated? Why are they loathed? That was something that came out. Where does that come from?
It comes from the Burmese, it really comes from the British legacy, the British colonial legacy, in large part. The Burmese kingdom did conquer Arakan state, Arakan kingdom in the 18th century, but the subsequent conquest of Burma by the British through Rakhine state into Burma is a major reason, because the British supported the Rohingya, and the Rohingya supported the British against the Burmese. So we're talking hundreds of years of antithesis, antipathy.
So you think it's more that political issue rather than religion per se?
Right. There are Muslim, there are Hindus, and there are Chinese, there are Christians who live in Myanmar. They have had challenges working with the Myanmar government. Some of the Christian ethnic groups have been in a civil war with the Myanmar government also, but they were instead included in the 135 listed categories.
Are there any Muslims in Myanmar who are not Rohingya that are, part of the political or social fabric?
My understanding is they're not. They're called by the, they're consistently called by the Myanmar, they're called Bengalis. They're called Bengali, they're not at all acknowledged as Rohingya.
I have a question about, was it Song Lee, the
Aung San
woman?
Suu Kyi?
What would happen if she did say something? It's my understanding that the military would probably get rid of her pretty fast. So I wondered what your view of it is. Everyone's judging her so much, but do we really understand the politics behind it?
Well, it's a very hard, I don't have an easy answer. her identity as a leader, the mother of the nation, is rooted in the Burma culture, in being Burma. And her father was a Burma, so this is her, she was actually born in 1945, he died in 1945, so her experience of her father is entirely through a discourse of him being the father of the nation and what the nation is. The Buddhist nationalists were important for her election. They were important for her, they were an important part of her wanting to connect with people in Myanmar when she was running for election. They were a part of her success. Now, they also ran their own parties. There were numerous parties, too many parties to count in two hands, fingers on two hands. But she also relied on that rhetoric to run her campaign. True, she also is somewhat powerless relative to the military. The way she got to power, though, in large part is because of her international moral authority and her credibility with an international human rights community. That international human rights community, the US ambassador, the British ambassador, the Canadian ambassador, the Australian ambassador, have been, when we were there in 2012 setting up our project, they were on her, trying to get her to acknowledge the situation, and she refused to recognize it. And they were trying to help her to figure out how to set up a way for her to stand on 2 feet and have the support of the international community. And she just couldn't do it. That, I think, is in large part the reason why you are seeing there was a tremendous, everybody knew that this was going to happen. The Buddhist nationalists that emerged in 2007, 2008, through 2011, 2012, they were spouting really hateful rhetoric. We brought 15 Myanmar mid-career professionals to the United States, to Seattle, to get training around information, learning how to be critical consumers of information, learning how to teach critical thinking skills, learning how to produce trustworthy information. We brought people from Rakhine, both Rakhine and Rohingya. We brought media, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu leaders to the University of Washington for this training, government officials, et cetera. And I had one incident of those 15. They loved being there. They loved getting to know each other, meeting across in ways that they had never been able to talk to each other before, except for the 2 people from Rakhine and Rohingya, the Rakhine member and the Rohingya. And it was the one incident that I had to actually intervene as the leader of the project and separate them.
Just to follow up on...
We knew, sorry, just to say,
please.
we knew in 2012 this was going to be a problem. There was already hateful rhetoric, and she never, in her entire campaign, ever countered it.
Is there any way that you can assign a number, percentage of people who are in Myanmar who actually do support the Rohingya, who have enough courage to come out? Is it 1%? Is it 0? Is it 5%? No numbers.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Except your personal. All right, Lois, please.
I mean, I'll tell an anecdote that I told
Okay.
on Tuesday very quickly. One of our subcontractors also runs an international research institute, independent think tank in Yangon, and she earned her credibility in doing research post-Nargis, doing a number of different evaluations of the Nargis humanitarian assistance and its impact. And so she had relationships with the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP. The UNDP, so we worked with her for about 3 years, and then in 2016 I was visiting, we had a big conference in Yangon, and she came back from some field work in Rakhine State at the behest of the UNDP to do some research on what was happening in the internment camps. So most of the Rohingya who still live in Rakhine State have been displaced from their villages and put into internment camps. She went to those camps, she interviewed the Rohingya, and she interviewed the Rakhine villagers who lived next door to the camps. And the Rakhine villagers said, yes, the Rohingya have lived here longer than we have. The Rohingya, yes, they lived here, but they don't belong here. She came back, and I saw her the night she came back. We had dinner together. She was devastated. She had no idea. She was completely taken by the rhetoric that she had heard in Yangon, in the media, on Facebook. She thought that the Rohingya didn't belong there, that they were illegal, that they were possibly terrorists, and for her to see it firsthand just blew her mind. And that is just, and she's a very well-educated woman, about mid-30s, who probably, you would think would know.
Different topic. Where do they get the support for their military in terms of their tanks, helicopters? What country are they getting their equipment from?
China and Russia, for the most part. They earn their, there's a lot of crony capitalism in Myanmar, so there's illicit drug running, and there are gems and oil that help support, the currency to pay for that.
I understand that the living conditions in Bangladesh in the refugee camps are horrendous. And one of the boys' families lives in the camp with very little shelter and no medical help. The other boy's family lives in Rakhine State, and they're afraid to leave the house because if they leave the home, they might get shot if they go to the village. And they have a large family. They know that they can't walk the distance with the small children that they have, and they're afraid to get on the boat because so many boats have sunk. Looking at the list of helping agencies that you had listed, which agencies, if you're going to donate to, which ones do you consider the most effective?
Well, the way I think we can, sorry. Well, BRAC is a Bangladeshi organization, probably the #1 NGO in the world. It's also it was the founder of the Grameen Bank, Muhammad Yunus's organization. They are doing a lot of the very important work in the Cox's Bazar. So if I were to think about them. I think Médecins Sans Frontières and, I don't have my list here, is trying to work. It's pretty hard to get into Rakhine State at all. So, in IRC, International Rescue Committee, is one of the main groups working in Rakhine State, and they're very reputable, based in New York. Yeah.
Could I, let's talk about kind of what can be done, and certainly one thing that we as Americans, we travel there, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we've heard is people travel there. There's some IF people who are there right now, et cetera. And Pam here, organizes tours. And so let me just play the devil's advocate, and Trevor Cutts, the young man who presented to the class on Tuesday, whose uncle is head of the UN Humanitarian Crisis Group, he felt very passionate that nobody should travel there because the money is simply going to go into the military's pockets and you're just going to help the regime. So, I'm just interested in a little more exploration of that issue. What is the right thing to do? You go and you hope that you're spreading good ideas, or you don't go because of, worrying about who you're supporting and where your money's going?
Looking at Pam, I think... I'm the daughter of a diplomat. I believe in the power of dialogue. and the possibilities of connecting. You do have to be conscientious whether or not you're going to travel and you want to preserve the environment and do it ecologically, or you want to do it to take care of, be humane and be conscientious of a regime that might be particularly harmful. I think in this day and age, if you were to go to Myanmar and try to speak up, it actually might be quite dangerous to be too vocal about the situation. I do have an organization in Myanmar that was our other contractor, the Myanmar Book Aid and Preservation Foundation. I didn't list them here, but they do organize educational tours, and they do promote information literacy, and they're a wonderful locally based organization. I think trying to find locally based organizations of people who are trying to make a difference, those people need all the help that you can give them. So developing a list of them, working with people that are reputable would be what my recommendation, and I can put Pam in touch with Myanmar Book Aid. Thon Thao Gong was one of our lead people, and he's very, very thoughtful.
Time for one more question. Is there somebody who has a microphone? Yeah.
Your discussion is a very depressing one.
Sorry. That's true.
And there isn't much hope. Anyone in the country, you can't talk about it. The major powers are certainly not coming to their aid. The picture is one of hopelessness. Nothing I heard is an out. There's no one coming to their defense. There's no one. We're about to lose how many hundreds of thousands could be in Bangladesh in 6 months when they fall into the mud. So my comment is I get a lot of hopelessness in your discussion.
That's a great note to end on. Another happy IAF event. Come on, Sarah.
It is depressing. I find it was really hard to prepare this talk. I tend to be someone who is a glass half full person. I'm always looking for, I was part of a lecture series in the fall called Trump in the World. And I gave a lecture on, what is the implication of the US pulling out of the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accord, and I actually had a positive end note for that, believe it or not. I think that Gollum said this the other day. I think that one of the challenges for the Rohingya is that they don't have a leader. They don't have somebody who's sort of bringing people together, per se. That said, I had an interesting, so I don't have an answer for you. It's depressing. That shouldn't stop us from doing something. That shouldn't stop us from raising awareness. That shouldn't stop us. Change as it is happening here, the only way change is going to happen is from people making noise, getting out there and doing something. I think that there's a lot that can be done. We need to make a lot of noise about it. We can make something happen here. Just to say, I had 2 weeks ago in my office a representative from something called the Rohingya Project. It's a group of people from the diaspora, the Rohingya diaspora. The person who runs that set up the Rohingya television satellite network, Rohingya Vision. You can look it up. They came to talk to me about seeing whether my students could do some research for them that would help them make the case for cryptocurrency that the Rohingya could become a part of that would then give them an international ID that would be recognized as an international ID in the international system. Really super interesting idea coming from the Rohingya community. And it'll be based on blockchain modeling. This is the same person who has helped support Unicode development on the web so that there's actually a Rohingya language that can be found on the web where students from Rohingya from around the world can learn about their history and their culture, and he's developing a library and resources and things like that. So the diaspora via social media, so the opposite of this Facebook story, digital media, online media is trying to come up with some solutions for themselves that will build connections and build capacity. They recognize that the Rohingya because they have no ID, they can't get a bank account. Because they have no ID, they can't get health care. Because they have no ID, they can't get an education. Because they have no ID, they cannot work. They decided that the first thing they need to do is figure out how to get them money and how to get them an ID, and their solution is through cryptocurrency. Blockchain modeling, very interesting. We'll see what happens. They've gotten some interest from the United Nations on this possibility. So,
all right, there you
there you
go.
go.
Yeah, so young people, I mean, they appreciate what cryptocurrency is and all of that. Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. Fabulous presentation. Thank you.